What kills more soldiers in war, the enemy's bullets or the orders designed to protect them? At first glance, the question seems absurd, almost insulting to anyone who has worn a uniform and faced combat. But on a single sheet of paper delivered at dawn on July 20th, 1950, something arrived that would answer that question in the most horrifying way possible. Willie Jackson watched 17 men from his company die that day, and not one of them was killed by North Korean fire. They followed their orders perfectly, every single one of them, right up until the moment their bodies gave out and they collapsed bleeding into the Korean dust. The contradiction was impossible to ignore once you saw it happening, soldiers dropping without a shot being fired. And yet everyone kept moving forward because that was what the orders demanded, even as the thing meant to save them became the very thing destroying them from the inside out. July 1950 marked the beginning of what Korean meteorologists would later confirm as the hottest and driest summer in the peninsula's recorded history, with temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit for 23 consecutive days in the southeastern provinces, where American forces had established their defensive positions against the North Korean advance that had begun exactly 25 days earlier, when 75,000 soldiers of the Korean People's Army poured across the 38th parallel in a coordinated assault that caught American intelligence agencies completely unprepared. The 24th Infantry Regiment, a segregated unit composed almost entirely of African-American enlisted men under white officers who had received their commissions less than 6 months before deployment, arrived at the town of Yechon on July 19th as part of the 25th Infantry Division's desperate attempt to slow the communist offensive that had already pushed Republic of Korea forces to the brink of total collapse and threatened to drive all United Nations troops into the sea of Japan within a matter of weeks if the tide could not be reversed immediately. Willie Jackson carried more than his M1 Garand rifle and 60 pounds of combat equipment through the dust-choked mountain roads leading to Yechon. He carried the weight of being one of only 3 soldiers in Baker Company who had survived the Bataan Death March 8 years earlier during the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, an experience that taught him exactly how long a man could function without water before his body began consuming itself from the inside, and how quickly dehydration could transform even the strongest soldiers into hallucinating shells, who would sign any confession or betray any secret in exchange for a single cup of clean water. The intelligence briefing at the battalion command post painted a grim tactical picture that contradicted the optimistic reports being sent to 8th Army headquarters in Daegu, where senior commanders who had never experienced combat in the Korean summer heat continued to believe that American firepower alone would reverse the tide of North Korean victories that had brought communist forces within striking distance of the vital port city of Busan and the last defensible position on the entire peninsula. Willie Jackson's company commander, First Lieutenant Robert Hayes, a 23-year-old West Point graduate who had been assigned to the 24th Regiment against his clearly stated preference for a posting with a white infantry unit, and who made his contempt for his soldiers abundantly clear through his habit of referring to them as inherently inferior fighting men who required twice the supervision of their white counterparts, explained that Baker Company would lead the assault to recapture Yechon from an estimated 200 North Korean soldiers who had fortified positions throughout the town's center and controlled the only reliable water source within a 15-mile radius of the American advance, a strategic objective that suddenly became more important than any tactical consideration when scouts reported that the towns well remained operational despite the drought. The mission briefing included detailed information about enemy positions, expected resistance levels, ammunition resupply points, and the exact coordinates where artillery support could be called if the assault stalled, but dedicated exactly 0 sentences to the question of how 147 soldiers would survive 3 days of combat operations in record-breaking heat without access to clean drinking water, a logistical oversight that would prove more lethal than any North Korean machine gun emplacement that awaited them in Yekon's narrow streets. The regiment's medical officer, Captain David Morrison, had been warning division headquarters for 2 weeks that the traditional Korean agricultural practice of fertilizing rice paddies with human waste created ideal conditions for the spread of bacillary dysentery, a bacterial infection caused by Shigella flexneri that could incapacitate an entire infantry company within 48 hours if soldiers consumed contaminated water from the irrigation ditches and agricultural fields that surrounded every village and town in the operational area, and that had already sent 63 soldiers from the 24th Regiment to field hospitals, with symptoms including violent diarrhea, fever exceeding 104 degrees, and bloody stools that indicated severe intestinal damage. Morrison had specifically requested an emergency airlift of water purification tablets manufactured by Abbott Laboratories, the small chlorine-based pills that could render even sewage-contaminated water safe for consumption within 30 minutes through a chemical process that killed 99.9% of all bacteria and parasites without requiring any specialized equipment beyond the standard-issue canteen that every soldier carried, but supply officers at division level had. Classified water purification tablets as a low-priority item compared to artillery shells and rifle ammunition, a decision that reflected the fundamental misunderstanding among rear-echelon staff officers about the nature of warfare in an environment where the human body lost 2 gallons of fluid per day through sweat alone, and where combat effectiveness degraded by 50% when soldiers experienced even mild dehydration that affected judgment and physical coordination. The temperature had already reached 94 degrees Fahrenheit when Willie Jackson's platoon began its approach march toward Yechon at 0600 hours on July 20th, moving through terrain that offered no shade beyond occasional clusters of stunted trees that had been stripped of their leaves by earlier artillery bombardments, and kicked up clouds of fine dust that coated every exposed surface with a grey film that turned to mud when mixed with sweat and made breathing feel like inhaling ground glass. Soldiers had emptied their 2-quart canteens within the first hour of movement, despite strict orders to ration water consumption to 1 mouthful every 30 minutes, and the rice paddies alongside the road presented a terrible temptation with their surfaces covered with a green film that everyone recognized as algae, growing in water that had been fertilized with human and animal waste for centuries, but that still looked infinitely more appealing than the prospect of marching another 4 miles under a sun that felt like it was actively trying to kill them. 3 soldiers from the lead squad filled their canteens from an irrigation ditch at the 6-mile mark, despite direct orders from their squad leader, Sergeant Thomas Reed, gambling that thirst presented a more immediate threat than whatever diseases might be swimming in that fetid water, and that the company would reach Yechon's well before any bacteria had time to take hold in their intestines. First Sergeant Marcus Williams collapsed at 0930 hours. Blood poured from both ends. No enemy contact yet. Lieutenant Hayes called for the company medic. Willie Jackson watched Williams convulse in the roadside dust while the platoon pressed forward toward Yechon. The mission came first. Always the mission. They were still 4 miles from the town when the second man went down screaming. The official order arrived 20 minutes after First Sergeant Williams stopped breathing, delivered by a runner from battalion headquarters who looked fresh enough to suggest he had spent the entire morning in an air-conditioned tent while Baker Company marched through hell with empty canteens and watching their non-commissioned officers die in agony. Lieutenant Hayes read the single-typed paragraph aloud to the assembled platoon leaders while soldiers continued dropping around them, his voice carrying that peculiar tone of a man who recognized he was about to enforce something catastrophically stupid, but lacked either the courage or the authority to question orders that came stamped with a colonel's signature and the full weight of military regulation. The order stated in clear, unambiguous language that all personnel of the 24th Infantry Regiment were hereby forbidden from consuming any water that had not been treated with approved purification tablets, and that any soldier observed drinking from local water sources including wells, streams, irrigation ditches or rice paddies would face immediate court-martial charges for willful disobedience of a direct order in a combat zone, an offense that carried a maximum sentence of death by firing squad under the Uniform Code of Military Justice that had been adopted just 1 year earlier. The order made perfect medical sense in theory, protecting soldiers from the dysentery epidemic that had already hospitalized dozens of men and killed at least 3 that morning alone. But it failed to address the single most important practical question that every soldier standing in that formation was thinking, but nobody dared to voice aloud. Where exactly were they supposed to obtain these purification tablets that the order referenced when division supply had failed to deliver a single bottle to the regiment, despite 2 weeks of urgent requests from the medical officer, who was now treating soldiers for the exact disease the tablets were meant to prevent? Willie Jackson had learned during 8 months as a Japanese prisoner of war that military bureaucracy possessed an almost supernatural ability to create situations where following orders guaranteed death, while disobeying orders merely offered a chance of survival, and he recognized immediately that this order represented exactly that type of impossible choice wrapped in official language and delivered with the expectation of unquestioning obedience. The march to Yechon continued with 139 soldiers still capable of movement, 8 men having been left behind, with the company medic who had exhausted his supply of anti-diarrheal medication before 1000 hours and was now reduced to offering dying men morphine to ease their passage. While he waited for an evacuation vehicle that division headquarters kept promising would arrive within the hour, but that everyone knew would not come until long after the battle for Yechon had been decided one way or another. Willie carried 2 canteens on his belt, both completely dry except for a few drops that he had been saving for an emergency, that he was increasingly certain had already arrived, and he watched the rice paddies slide past with a thirst so profound that his throat had stopped producing saliva, and every swallow felt like dragging sandpaper across raw meat. But he also remembered with perfect clarity what dysentery had done to prisoners in the Philippine camps, where men would beg for bullets to end the suffering that came from losing control of every bodily function, while their intestines literally dissolved from bacterial infection. The choice presented itself as a simple equation that contained no correct answer. Drink the contaminated water and face a 70% chance of contracting dysentery that would kill you in 3 to 5 days of unimaginable agony, or refuse to drink and face a 100% certainty of heat stroke that would kill you in 6 to 8 hours through a combination of organ failure and brain damage caused by core body temperature exceeding 106 degrees Fahrenheit. The landscape around them had transformed into something from a fever dream, with heat waves rising from the dirt road, creating optical illusions that made distant objects appear to float above the ground and causing several soldiers to report seeing water sources that disappeared when approached. A phenomenon that the company medic had explained was caused by severe dehydration affecting the brain's visual processing centers and would only get worse as fluid loss continued. Private James Morrison, a 19-year-old kid from Detroit who had been drafted 6 months after graduating high school and who still wrote letters to his mother every Sunday describing Korea as an adventure that would make him appreciate home when he finally returned, began talking to people who were not there around 1100 hours, carrying on detailed conversations with his dead grandmother about Sunday dinners and high school football games, while his eyes rolled back to show only whites and his legs kept moving forward through pure muscle memory, even though his conscious mind had clearly left the formation somewhere around the 8-mile marker. 3 more soldiers collapsed within the next 30 minutes, their bodies simply shutting down when core temperatures exceeded the threshold where human cells could continue functioning, and Lieutenant Hayes made the decision to leave them where they fell, with instructions that recovery teams would collect them after Baker Company secured Yechon. A pragmatic choice that everyone understood was really an admission that the mission timeline mattered more than individual lives, and that soldiers, who could not keep pace in combat, became acceptable losses in the mathematics of warfare. The first North Korean positions appeared at 1200 hours, machine gun nests dug into the hillside, overlooking the final approach to Yechon, with clear fields of fire that could shred an attacking force before it covered half the distance to the town's outskirts. Baker Company had been marching for 6 hours in temperatures that now exceeded 102 degrees Fahrenheit, with 0 water resupply, and approximately 1/3 of its original strength, either dead, dying, or incapacitated by dehydration, severe enough to prevent combat effectiveness. Lieutenant Hayes called for an artillery barrage to suppress the enemy positions, while the company spread out into assault formation, and Willie Jackson found himself calculating odds that had nothing to do with North Korean bullets, and everything to do with whether his body contained enough fluid to reach the towns well before his kidneys shut down completely. The artillery shells began falling at 12:15 hours. Yechon burned ahead of them. Willie Jackson saw the well in the town center through his rifle sights. 500 yards away, North Korean soldiers waited between here and there. His canteen remained empty. The order remained absolute. 17 men were already dead from following it. The contradiction was killing them faster than any enemy could manage. Willie Jackson made his choice. He would reach that well or die trying, and to hell with orders that valued regulations over survival. The assault on Yechon began with artillery fire that transformed the town's wooden structures into kindling and sent columns of black smoke rising into the afternoon sky, where they hung motionless in air so hot and still that even fire seemed reluctant to spread beyond its initial targets, creating isolated pockets of flame throughout the town rather than the comprehensive conflagration that American fire planners had intended when they calculated the tonnage of high explosive and white, phosphorus shells required to suppress enemy resistance before infantry moved into the streets. Willie Jackson advanced with the first assault wave, moving in a crouch that his dehydrated muscles protested with every step, his vision narrowing into a tunnel that contained only the 100 yards of dirt road between his current position and the first cluster of buildings where North Korean machine gunners had established interlocking fields of fire designed to turn the main approach into a killing zone that would stack American bodies 3 deep before anyone reached effective rifle range. The theoretical tactics that Lieutenant Hayes had outlined during the pre-assault briefing called for suppressing fire from one squad, while another maneuvered to flank enemy positions. A textbook infantry assault that assumed soldiers possessed the physical capacity to execute complex movements under fire and the mental clarity to respond to changing battlefield conditions. But theory evaporated when confronted with the reality of men so dehydrated that their hands shook too violently to aim rifles accurately, and whose reaction times had slowed to the point where they were processing sensory information several seconds after events had already occurred, creating a dangerous disconnect between perception and reality that got soldiers killed in combat situations that required split-second decisions. The North Korean defenders opened fire at 300 yards, their Type 92 heavy machine guns throwing 7.7mm rounds that cracked past Willie Jackson's head with a sound like canvas tearing and kicked up geysers of dust when they impacted the road surface, forcing the assault wave to dive for whatever cover the barren landscape offered, which amounted to shallow irrigation ditches that ran parallel to the road and provided concealment but zero protection against bullets that could punch through 2 feet of packed earth and still retain enough kinetic energy to shatter bone. Private Morrison never made it to the ditch, his dehydration-addled brain failing to process the danger quickly enough to trigger the survival instinct that should have sent him diving for cover the instant those machine guns opened fire. And Willie Jackson watched the 19-year-old kid who had been talking to his dead grandmother just an hour earlier take 3 rounds across the chest that spun him completely around before he collapsed face first into the road, where his body twitched twice and then lay still in a spreading pool of blood that soaked into the dust and disappeared within seconds in heat, so intense it was literally evaporating blood faster than it could flow from fatal wounds. 6 more soldiers went down in the first 30 seconds of contact, some from enemy fire, but at least 2 from simple physical collapse, as bodies that had been pushed beyond all reasonable endurance finally surrendered to heat stroke that caused their brains to swell against their skulls and triggered seizures that left them convulsing in the open where North Korean gunners could use them for target practice. And Willie Jackson felt a rage building in his chest that had nothing to do with the enemy soldiers who were quite reasonably trying to kill him, and everything to do with the chain of decisions, by officers who would never face consequences for their incompetence that had placed him in a situation where American soldiers were being killed by their own command structure's failure to provide the most basic resource that human beings required to function in combat conditions. The well in Yecon's town center remained visible through gaps in the smoke, perhaps 400 yards distant now, close enough that Willie could see the wooden bucket hanging from its rope and the stone rim that surrounded the opening, and that image became the singular focus of every remaining scrap of willpower he possessed, a goal so compelling that tactical considerations about enemy positions and fields of fire became secondary to the primal need to reach water before his body shut down completely. Lieutenant Hayes attempted to organize a flanking maneuver, using what remained of 2nd Platoon, but his orders emerged as barely coherent fragments shouted across 50 yards of open ground where North Korean bullets made communication effectively impossible, and where soldiers were too focused on immediate survival to process complex tactical instructions that required coordinated movement between multiple squads operating under fire. The assault stalled at 200 yards from the town's edge, with Baker Company pinned in irrigation ditches that offered temporary safety but led nowhere useful, and that would become death traps if North Korean forces decided to maneuver around American positions and attack from the flanks or rear. A tactical reality that every soldier recognized, even through the fog of severe dehydration, that was rapidly degrading their ability to think clearly about anything beyond the immediate need for water. Willie Jackson's hands had stopped shaking, not because his condition had improved, but because his nervous system was beginning to shut down non-essential functions in a desperate attempt to preserve core operations, and he recognized this symptom from the Philippine camps where he had watched men reach this stage of dehydration, and understood that he had perhaps 30 minutes before organ failure became irreversible, regardless of whether he found water or not. Sergeant Thomas Reed made the decision that would later appear in official after-action reports as a brilliant tactical improvisation, but that everyone who survived Yechon understood was really just a desperate gamble by a man who knew his soldiers would die in those ditches if they did not move immediately toward the only water source within reach. Reed stood up in full view of North Korean machine gun positions and began running directly toward Yecon's center, not in a combat crouch or using any tactical movement techniques, but in a straight sprint that sacrificed all cover and concealment in favor of pure speed. And his action created exactly the psychological effect he had gambled on when 37 soldiers saw their sergeant charging and instinctively followed despite every tactical principle they had been taught about fire and maneuver and proper assault techniques. The human wave that rose from those irrigation ditches represented the complete abandonment of military doctrine in favor of something more primal, a collective decision by men pushed beyond their limits that survival required reaching that well regardless of what North Korean bullets might do to them along the way. Willie Jackson ran. Bullets snapped past. Men fell around him. The well grew closer. 200 yards. 150. North Korean fire intensified. More soldiers dropped. The mathematics of the assault were simple and terrible. Half the company would die reaching that well. The other half would die if they did not. Willie Jackson kept running. His vision had narrowed to a pinpoint. His lungs burned. His legs threatened to give out with every step. 100 yards to water. 75. 50. North Korean soldiers appeared in windows. Rifle fire joined the machine guns. Willie Jackson saw Sergeant Reed go down 20 yards from the well. 25 yards now, 15, 10. The wooden bucket swung on its rope. 5 yards. Willie Jackson dove over the stone rim. His hands grabbed the bucket. He pulled. The rope held. Water rose from darkness below. The first drops touched his lips. Sweet. Clean. Cold. Everything the order said would kill him. Willie Jackson drank until his stomach cramped, and his body rejected the sudden influx of liquid it had been screaming for during 6 hours of hell, vomiting the first 2 cupfuls back up before his system adjusted and began accepting water in smaller quantities that his dehydrated tissues absorbed, with an urgency that felt almost violent in its intensity, and he remained crouched behind the well's stone rim while North Korean rifle fire cracked overhead and punched holes through the wooden bucket that continued delivering salvation from the darkness below, despite the enemy's best efforts to deny American soldiers the resource they had been willing to die to reach. 13 soldiers from Baker Company made it to the well alive. Their bodies sprawled around the stone structure in various stages of collapse, while they took turns hauling up buckets and drinking with a desperation that transcended military discipline or tactical awareness. And Willie Jackson watched each man's face transform as clean water reversed the shutdown process that had been killing them by degrees throughout the morning's march and afternoon's assault. The well water was cold, drawn from an aquifer deep enough to remain untouched by the surface contamination that made rice paddy water a death sentence, and Willie Jackson realized with a clarity that felt like ice water through his veins, that division headquarters had condemned soldiers to die from dehydration, while forbidding them to drink from the one water source in the entire operational area that had never posed any disease risk whatsoever, a cosmic irony so profound that it transcended simple incompetence and entered the realm of criminal negligence by officers who had issued orders without bothering to verify whether those orders made any tactical or medical sense in the actual conditions their soldiers faced. The battle for Yechon continued around them for another 3 hours, with Baker Company's survivors clearing buildings room by room, while North Korean defenders fought with the tenacity of men who understood that retreat meant execution by their own political officers, and that surrender meant imprisonment in camps where survival rates hovered around 30%, according to intelligence reports that had filtered down to infantry units. Willie Jackson's body gradually recovered its combat effectiveness as hydration restored his cognitive function and muscle coordination, transforming him from a shambling near corpse who could barely aim his rifle into a functioning soldier capable of executing the close-quarters battle tactics that urban warfare demanded. And he moved through Yechon's smoke-filled streets with a rifle that no longer shook in his hands and vision that had expanded back to normal peripheral awareness instead of the tunnel vision that severe dehydration had imposed. The North Korean forces withdrew from the town by 1600 hours, abandoning their positions after suffering casualties that American intelligence would later estimate at 75% of the original garrison, and Baker Company took control of Yechon at a cost that official reports would describe as acceptable, given the strategic importance of securing the town and denying enemy forces access to the central mountain corridors that led toward Busan and the final defensive perimeter that represented the last stand for United Nations forces in Korea. The casualty accounting began at 1700 hours when Lieutenant Hayes ordered a formation that revealed the true cost of the day's operations, measured not in tactical objectives secured or enemy soldiers killed, but in the empty spaces where American soldiers should have been standing if command decisions had valued their lives as highly as operational timelines. Baker Company had departed its assembly area that morning with 147 soldiers, lost 8 to dysentery before contact with enemy forces, suffered 12 killed in action during the assault on Yechon, and counted an additional 34 dead from heat stroke and dehydration-related organ failure, bringing total casualties to 54 soldiers, or approximately 37% of the company's strength eliminated in a single day of operations where enemy action had accounted for less than 1/4 of American deaths. Willie Jackson stood in that formation and looked at the faces of the survivors, recognizing that every man still breathing had made the same choice he had made, had broken the same order he had broken, had drunk from the well, or from rice paddies, or from irrigation ditches, because their bodies had given them an ultimatum that superseded any regulation or threat of court-martial, and he understood with absolute certainty that the 17 soldiers who had died following Lieutenant Hayes's order to avoid all water sources had been killed not by bacteria or parasites, but by obedience itself transformed into a lethal weapon through the incompetence of officers who wrote regulations in air-conditioned offices without understanding the realities of combat operations conducted in conditions that rendered those regulations actively suicidal. The water purification tablets arrived at 2200 hours that evening, delivered by supply truck, along with ammunition resupply and rations, 3 weeks after Captain Morrison had first requested them, and approximately 12 hours too late to save the soldiers who had died, because Division Headquarters had classified water purification as a low-priority logistics item. Lieutenant Hayes distributed the tablets to surviving soldiers with instructions that all water consumption would henceforth comply with proper purification protocols, and Willie Jackson accepted his allotment of small chlorine pills that could have prevented every single dehydration death if they had arrived when requested. Feeling the weight of those tablets in his palm and calculating the mathematics of bureaucratic failure that had traded American lives for supply chain efficiency. Nobody mentioned the order that had forbidden drinking unpurified water. Nobody acknowledged that every survivor had violated that order multiple times, and nobody suggested that court-martial proceedings should be initiated against soldiers who had chosen survival over regulation. creating an unspoken agreement that the day's events would be recorded in official reports as a hard-fought victory rather than a catastrophic failure of command judgment that had killed more Americans than enemy. Action. Willie Jackson sat against the well's stone rim that night and looked at the wooden bucket that had saved his life, running his fingers over bullet holes that North Korean soldiers had punched through the wood, while he and 12 others had drunk their fill and lived to see another day in a war that would continue for another 3 years and claim another 33,000 American lives before politicians in distant capitals finally agreed to stop the killing and accept a stalemate that left Korea divided exactly where it had been divided before the first shots were fired. The official history would record that the 24th Infantry Regiment captured Yechon on July 20, 1950, in the first American victory of the Korean War, and that achievement would be celebrated as proof that United Nations forces could defeat North Korean aggression if given proper support and leadership. But Willie Jackson knew a different truth that would never appear in any official report or history book or medal citation. The order had killed 17 men. The well had saved 13. The difference between those numbers represented the gap between what regulations demanded and what reality required. Willie Jackson had survived by recognizing that gap and choosing accordingly. He had broken the order. He had drunk forbidden water. He had lived. Every man who had followed Lieutenant Hayes's command exactly as written had died. Their bodies left in irrigation ditches or on dusty roads or in field hospitals where medics could do nothing except ease their passage into death from organ failure that purification tablets would have prevented if anyone in the supply chain had bothered to prioritize soldier survival over bureaucratic procedure. The tablets sat unused in Willie Jackson's pocket. The well water had been clean all along. The order had been wrong from the start, and 17 men had paid the price for that mistake with their lives, while the officers who had issued that order slept safely in headquarters tents and would face zero consequences for decisions that had turned regulation into execution. That was the truth of Yechon. That was the truth of orders that killed more effectively than any enemy. That was the truth Willie Jackson would carry for the rest of his life, knowing that sometimes survival required breaking the rules that people who never faced the consequences had written for people who did.